Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Robert Jensen. He's an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. Hi, Bob.
Hello, Sonali.
A white police officer in Milwaukee will not be charged in the fatal shooting death of an unarmed black man in what has become a familiar script in police relations across the nation. Officer Christopher Manny shot 31-year-old Dontre Hamilton in April. Hamilton suffered from mental illness, including schizophrenia. Milwaukee County DA John Chisholm said on Monday that Manny acted in self-defense. Meanwhile, giving in to police pressure in the wake of the shooting deaths of two NYPD officers this weekend, New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio has called for a break in anti-police brutality protests until after the funerals of the two officers. De Blasio met with the families of the slain officers and said, quote, "It's so hard to make sense of it how one deeply troubled, violent individual could do this to these good families." Activists have fired back, saying they will not pause in their protests. Now, Bob, given the effect of war that police seem to have declared on Black America, how can they justify asking people to stop protesting? And do we ever see politicians pander like this to the families of police victims?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure the metaphor of a war on Black America is the most accurate or the most helpful. I don't think of this as police officers engaged in a war on a specific community. We have a problem in policing in the way we ask our police agencies to interact with the public, and that focuses on the most vulnerable and the most oppressed, which of course is often Black America. But it's really more, I think, a more general crisis of policing. And unfortunately, in New York, this is denigrated into a question of is one for or against the police, instead of asking as a society, when we send police out into the community and create the conditions under which these situations escalate, how are we helping? And the point is we're not.
North Korea's tiny internet system has apparently been restored after a 10-hour shutdown. The system was targeted by a denial of service attack, clearly suggesting a malicious external hack. Internet service in North Korea is extremely limited, with just over 1,000 web addresses accessible only to the country's elite. Taking the system down would require little effort. The outage comes in the middle of an ongoing battle between the U.S. and North Korea over the hacking of Sony Entertainment Studios and its new film, The Interview. The Daily Beast, speculating that the U.S. government might possibly have been behind knocking North Korea's internet offline, said, quote, "Any retaliation by the U.S. government for the Sony hack would be significantly constrained by some very tricky and nuanced aspects of international law. Hacking the computers of an American company and stealing and erasing confidential information likely doesn't rise to the level of an armed attack against the United States," end of quote. Now, Bob, how serious a battle could this turn into? North Korea is a very small country, which has been relentlessly pushed around by the U.S. and, of course, by Hollywood.
Yeah, well, the first thing we should always ask is when the U.S. engages in activities, how would we feel if those same activities were directed against the U.S.? If North Korea knocked out the U.S. internet service for the better part of a day, of course, we would go ballistic in this country. I think your point is well taken that, North Korea is a casualty of the Cold War. The reality of the geopolitical history there is that the United States was willing to sacrifice people in other parts of the world for Cold War politics. And North Korea is kind of the last lingering place where we see the horror of that. I think that, as is always the case, the U.S. public has to realize there's a history to this question. It didn't just start yesterday.
Right. And finally, a retired naval officer has taken it upon himself to sue the producers of Citizen4, the acclaimed documentary by Laura Poitras, which is based on the historic encounter between journalists and NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden. Claiming to represent the American public, Horace Edwards' lawsuit accuses Poitras and others from, quote, profiteering off of the theft and misuse of the NSA's blueprints for spying on the American public. The suit was filed in a federal court in Kansas and also describes those involved as people, quote, pretending to be journalists and whistleblowers, but in effect are evading the country and betraying their country. Now, I'm not sure just how rich Laura Poitras has gotten off of the film, Bob. She's an independent filmmaker after all. Still, what do you make of this lawsuit?
Well, Sonali, you know from direct experience that independent journalists are fabulously wealthy, so that's well known. This is a lawsuit that, of course, isn't serious in legal terms. Remember, in the United States, anybody can sue anybody for anything. I'm thinking of suing Uprising for not making me more attractive on Skype, for instance. But the real question, of course, is this goes to this split in the United States between people who, when presented with evidence of governmental misbehavior, identify with the government, as opposed to those of us who, when presented with that same evidence, want to critique and reform the government. And so I think as a legal issue, this is trivial and silly, but as a social question, as a deep political rift in the US, I think it tells us a lot.
Well, Bob Jensen, always a pleasure to have you on. We'll send our hair and makeup person over to you in Texas there for next week. Robert
Don't
Jensen.
worry, it won't do any good. Thanks.
Robert Jensen is our daily Newsflash guest expert. He's also a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. This is Uprising. When we come back, Darnell Hunt joins us in studio for the hour. We're going to have a wide-ranging discussion on diversity in Hollywood, not just representation of women and people of color, but stereotypes. Stay tuned.